In a world where empires rose on glory and buried their sins in silence, this channel opens the doors history tried to erase. Here, we don't tell the stories you learned in school. We uncover the rituals, the betrayals, the forbidden truths carved into palace walls. Every video is a descent into power, fear, and the dark secrets of kings, queens, and forgotten victims. So if you're ready to witness the side of history they tried to erase, subscribe to this channel so we can stay connected. Be sure to like the video and step into the shadows with us, where the real past still breathes. What if death was the kinder fate? What if the men who fell on the battlefield were the lucky ones? Because when the swords stopped, when the shields shattered, when the last warrior bled into the mud, a far darker ritual began. One history tried to bury in silence. The Vikings did not believe victory ended with slaughter. To them, true conquest was carved not into land, but into people. And the wives of defeated warriors became the canvas. Imagine standing in the ashes of your burning home, the smoke still clawing at your lungs, your husband's body lying somewhere beyond the flames, when the men who killed him seize your arm, not to kill you, but to claim you, not as prisoner, not as survivor, but as proof that your bloodline had fallen, proof that your identity now belonged to them. They were paraded in halls of victory, forced into marriages sanctified by gods they did not worship, branded, silenced, assimilated, until even their names dissolved into dust. Some were sacrificed, some enslaved, some forced to raise the children of the men who destroyed their world. And the cruelest truth, many prayed for the mercy of death, but were denied even that escape, because survival was the punishment. Tonight, we uncover the rituals hidden behind Viking glory, the ceremonies never sung in sagas, the suffering buried beneath conquest. This is the story of what Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors, and why, for them, death would have been kinder. The silence after the slaughter death came quickly for the men, but for the wives left standing in the smoke, something far darker had just begun. When the swords fell silent, their nightmare was only awakening. A battlefield was still warm when the screaming stopped. Axes lay buried in broken shields, and the mud drank deeply from the veins of men who had believed they would return home before nightfall. Smoke coiled upward from burning thatched roofs, turning the sky into a suffocating ceiling of ash. For the warriors, death had been swift. A blade through the throat, a spear between the ribs, a final breath swallowed by the roar of conquest. But for the women watching from doorways, from behind splintered fences, from beside cradles overturned in panic, the end of battle did not bring peace. It brought silence. And that silence was more terrifying than the clash of steel. When the Viking ships first appeared on the horizon that morning, many had prayed the rumors were exaggerated. Traders had spoken of raids before, of monasteries looted, of villages burned, but fear often travels faster than truth. Yet as the long ships slid through the mist like shadows carved from wood and iron, hope collapsed. The husbands had taken up swords not because they believed they would win, but because honor demanded they stand. To fall defending one's land was noble. To survive without resistance was shame. So they fought, and they died. And when the last defender fell, a new ritual began, one never written in the sagas sung beside roaring hearths. The Viking warriors did not rush immediately toward treasure. They did not begin with gold or livestock. Instead, they walked slowly through the village, searching not for wealth, but for witnesses. The wives of the fallen were gathered deliberately, pulled from hiding places, dragged from the ruins of homes that still smoldered. Children were torn from their arms. The conquerors understood something ancient and brutal. True victory was not proven on the battlefield. It was proven in what remained after. Imagine standing in the ashes of your home, the body of your husband cooling somewhere beyond sight, and realizing that your life has not been spared, it has been claimed. That realization spread through the women like ice beneath the skin. They were no longer protected by the men who bore their family names. In a world governed by strength, protection was survival. Without it, a woman became something else, not a widow, not a mourner, something transferable, something useful. The Vikings believed conquest was incomplete without humiliation. Gold could be reclaimed. Fields could be replanted. But shame could poison generations. By seizing the wives of defeated warriors, they carved defeat into the future itself. The women were lined before the surviving villagers, forced to kneel in the mud where their husbands' blood had dried. It was not random cruelty. It was theater. Every captured wife was a message written in flesh. Your protectors have fallen, and now even your lineage bends to us. Archaeological records tell us that slavery was deeply woven into Norse society. The word thrall was not rare. It was economic foundation. But behind that term lies a darker truth seldom spoken, the psychological warfare embedded within it. To enslave a warrior's wife was to erase his legacy publicly. To strip her of status was to declare his memory powerless. This was not merely capture. It was symbolic annihilation. As twilight settled over the ruined village, the women were herded toward the longships. Some resisted and were struck down. Others walked in numb silence, their grief too heavy for sound. The sea that had brought the invaders now became the boundary between their past and an unknown future. Chains were not always necessary. Fear bound tighter than iron. And as the ships pushed away from the burning shoreline, a terrible understanding dawned among the captives. Death had spared them. But what awaited across the dark waters would not be swift. It would not be merciful. It would unfold slowly, deliberately, a living punishment designed not only to break the body, but to dismantle the soul. The warriors had died as men of honor. The wives would live as something else entirely. And the worst part? Their suffering was only beginning. When women became symbols, gold was not the prize the Vikings valued most. Humiliation carried greater weight than treasure, and the wives of fallen warriors became the proof of conquest. When the long ships reached the northern shores, the women were not taken quietly into shadows as laborers alone. Their arrival was announced. Horns were blown across the fjords, echoing through pine forests and frozen cliffs like a call to witness victory. Villagers gathered along the docks, warriors, elders, traders, even children, all summoned to see what had been brought back from across the sea. Not just silver, not just grain, but living symbols of domination. The captives were forced onto the wooden piers under watchful eyes. Their clothing still carried the ash of burned homes. Their hair smelled of smoke. Some clutched fragments of fabric, torn from their husbands' cloaks, the last physical memory they possessed. But grief was not permitted dignity here. Viking culture treated conquest as spectacle, and spectacle required display. The women were lined in rows, inspected like livestock. Warriors boasted openly about which village they had destroyed, which husband they had slain, which wife now stood in chains because of their strength. To the Vikings, this was not senseless cruelty. It was ritualized power. Public humiliation served a cultural function. It reinforced hierarchy, rewarded warriors, and broadcast dominance to all who watched. A man who returned with captured wives proved more than battlefield skill. He proved he had shattered another society's core. Because in many cultures, the wife of a warrior represented lineage, honor, and continuity. To possess her was to possess the future of the defeated. Some women were immediately claimed by chieftains and jarls, not out of desire alone, but political symbolism. Taking the wife of a fallen leader sent a chilling message. Your bloodline now flows under my authority. These forced unions were staged before witnesses, sometimes announced during feasts, their declarations met with roars of approval. The woman's consent held no relevance. Her body became parchment, upon which conquest was written. Others were distributed among warriors as rewards. A brutal economy of flesh unfolded. The stronger the warrior's reputation, the higher the status of the captive he received. Women who had once lived as respected wives found themselves bartered between men who spoke of them in terms of utility, labor, reproduction, servitude. Identity dissolved quickly in this system. Names were rarely spoken. New titles replaced them: thrall, servant, property. Feasts marked the peak of this ritual humiliation. Inside the great longhouses, where torches spat smoke against carved wooden beams, the women were forced to serve ale to the very men who had slaughtered their families. Imagine trembling hands pouring mead into drinking horns while laughter erupted around you. Every spilled drop was met with mockery. Every lowered gaze was taken as submission. Their grief became entertainment woven into celebration. Historical sagas often glorify these feasts as symbols of Viking unity and strength. But hidden between poetic lines lies a darker subtext: conquered women functioning as living trophies. Some accounts suggest captives were forced to sing or dance, not as cultural exchange, but as degradation. Stripped of status, stripped of voice, they performed beneath the weight of collective humiliation. Branding and tattooing sometimes followed. Permanent marks carved into skin to signify ownership. Archaeological evidence and saga references hint that certain captives bore symbols linking them to specific households. These were not decorative. They were declarations, visible reminders that the woman no longer belonged to herself or her past. Yet even within this theater of dominance, fear was not one-sided. Some Viking households recognized the volatile power of captive grief. A woman who had lost everything could become unpredictable. For this reason, psychological breaking was prioritized early. Isolation, renaming, forced labor, all tools designed to dismantle resistance before it could take form. By the time the feasts ended and the torches dimmed, the transformation had begun. These women were no longer seen as widows of fallen warriors. They had been reshaped into symbols, proof that conquest reached beyond swords and shields into identity itself. But humiliation at feasts was only the surface ritual. What awaited them in daily life, in servitude, in chains both visible and unseen, would carve far deeper wounds. And the next phase of their fate would not be performed before crowds. It would unfold behind closed doors, where suffering became routine and dignity was dismantled piece by piece. Rituals that sanctified cruelty, some suffering was not hidden in shadows. It was dragged into the firelight and blessed by the gods. And in those rituals, terror became holy. In the north, religion and war were never separate. The same hands that lifted axes in battle later raised drinking horns to Odin. Victory was not simply celebrated, it was consecrated. And for the captured wives of defeated warriors, this meant their pain could be transformed into offering. When the feasting ended and daily servitude began, another layer of domination unfolded, one cloaked in ritual, chanting, and sacred ceremony. The Vikings believed deeply in the favor of their gods. Odin demanded strength. Thor demanded loyalty. Freya, in some traditions, received half of the slain in her hall. But what of the living captives? In certain accounts preserved in sagas and later chronicles, whispers tell of ceremonies where conquered women were made to participate in public rites of submission. Not always sacrifice in the literal sense, though that did occur, but symbolic death. A stripping away of former identity under divine witness. Picture a wooden temple lit by flickering torches. Carved idols stare from shadowed corners. The air smells of blood, smoke, and damp earth. A captive woman is brought forward before gathered villagers. Her old garments are torn away, replaced with rough wool, marking her new status. A priest or chieftain invokes the gods, declaring her past severed, her loyalty redirected by force. The community watches. The gods are invoked. Her humiliation becomes sanctified. Some ceremonies went further. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across Scandinavia suggests that certain women, possibly captives, were buried alongside powerful men, their remains showing signs of strangulation or ritual killing. The famous account of Ibn Fadlan, the Arab traveler who described a Norse funeral on the Volga River, recounts a slave girl who volunteered or was compelled to die alongside her master. While historians debate the frequency of such events, the narrative remains chilling. In these rituals, the body of a woman could become currency in the afterlife. For the wives of fallen warriors, this meant living under constant uncertainty. Would they serve in a household? Or would they be selected for something darker? Fear became a permanent companion. Each time a drumbeat echoed through the settlement, each time a gathering formed near the temple, dread tightened like a noose around the heart. Religion offered no refuge. It was part of the machinery. Even mock weddings carried ritual weight. A captive declared wife of her conqueror was not merely claimed privately. The union could be performed before witnesses, invoking gods as guardians of the bond. But this bond was forged from coercion. The woman's silence was interpreted as acceptance. Her tears were ignored. The ceremony rewrote reality. What had begun in violence was reframed as destiny. Psychologically, this was devastating. To be forced into a sacred rite twisted the mind. If the gods were invoked in your humiliation, where could you seek justice? Resistance risked being labeled not only rebellion, but blasphemy. And in a society where divine favor governed survival, that accusation was dangerous. Some captives were ordered to sing during rituals, chants praising victories that had destroyed their own lives. Their voices trembled beneath the weight of contradiction. To refuse meant punishment. To comply meant participating in their own erasure. This was cruelty layered with spiritual manipulation. Yet within these rites, something unexpected sometimes occurred. A woman might close her eyes and whisper a prayer to her own forgotten deity beneath the chant to Odin, a silent act of defiance carried in the heart. No one could police thought entirely. Even in sanctified humiliation, fragments of inner resistance survived. But those fragments were fragile, because the rituals did not end in one night. They were repeated, reinforced, woven into seasons and festivals. And with each repetition, the captive was reminded that her suffering was not accidental. It was approved by gods and community alike. The battlefield had taken their husbands. Servitude had taken their freedom. But these rituals aimed for something deeper. They sought to take belief itself, to break not just the body, but the foundation of the soul. And what happens when a soul is slowly stripped of its faith, its memory, its name? The answer lay in the next stage of their captivity, where chains were no longer symbolic, but constant. Chains on the body, chains on the soul. Not all chains were made of iron. Some were forged from silence, from fear, from the slow erasure of self. And those were the chains that never loosened. When the rituals ended and the torches dimmed, captivity settled into routine. But routine did not bring relief. It brought permanence. The wives of defeated warriors were absorbed into the lowest tier of Norse society, labeled thralls, a word that barely captures the depth of their subjugation. Thralls were not merely laborers. They were living property, existing at the mercy of masters whose moods dictated their survival. But for these women, the servitude carried an added cruelty. They had not been born into slavery. They remembered freedom, and memory made every task heavier. Dawn marked the beginning of their humiliation. Before the settlement stirred, they were already awake, ordered to scrub wooden floors still sticky with spilled ale from victory feasts. Floors where their captors had celebrated the deaths of their husbands. Each stroke of the cloth was more than labor. It was psychological warfare, a forced participation in the erasure of their former lives. They cooked meals they would never taste, prepared meats roasted over fires they were forbidden to sit beside. The scent alone became torment. Hunger was controlled deliberately. Not starvation. That would waste labor, but restriction. A constant reminder of hierarchy. Even nourishment became a privilege denied. Clothing, too, reinforced degradation. Fine garments once worn as wives of respected men were gone, burned or repurposed. In their place hung coarse wool dresses, rough against the skin, identical among thralls. Individuality dissolved beneath uniform hardship. Jewelry was stripped away. Hair was sometimes cut short, both practical and symbolic, removing a marker of femininity and pride. But physical labor was only one dimension. The deeper cruelty lay in unpredictability. A woman might spend one day tending livestock in icy fields, only to be dragged into a long house the next night, summoned not as a servant, but as a body to be used. Refusal was unthinkable. Punishment could range from beatings to public humiliation, designed to discourage resistance among other captives. Some were forced to serve unclothed during feasts, their vulnerability displayed before drunken warriors. Not for desire alone, but dominance. Public exposure functioned as ritual degradation, stripping away the last fragments of dignity. Laughter became another weapon. Mockery replaced names. Names, perhaps the most intimate chain of all. Many captives were renamed entirely. Their birth names, whispered once by mothers, spoken by husbands, were erased. In Norse culture, names carried lineage and honor. To remove a name was to sever a person from history itself. A captive might be called simply bondwoman, or given a crude nickname referencing her origin or suffering. Each time it was spoken, it reinforced her dispossession. Children complicated the bondage further. When captives bore children to their captors, emotional chains tightened. The child represented violation and love simultaneously. Mothers nurtured fiercely. Instinct could not be extinguished, yet every glance carried the shadow of how that life had begun. For the Vikings, these children symbolized victory made flesh. For the mothers, they were living reminders of conquest carved into the future. Yet even within these suffocating constraints, resilience flickered. Women formed quiet alliances, exchanging whispered words while grinding grain or washing linens by the river. They shared fragments of memory. A homeland song hummed softly, a prayer spoken under breath. These acts seemed small, but psychologically they preserved identity. Resistance did not always roar. Sometimes it survived as a whisper. Still, the weight of servitude pressed relentlessly. Over time, some women forgot the sound of their native language spoken freely. Memories blurred. Faces of lost husbands faded at the edges. This was the final cruelty of psychological captivity, not just forcing suffering, but eroding remembrance itself. Chains on the body could rust. They could break. But chains on the soul, forged from humiliation, silence, and identity erasure, endured far longer. And as years passed, a new phase of cruelty emerged. One that did not merely enslave the present, but sought to rewrite the future entirely. The death that breathes. There is a fate worse than chains, worse than ritual humiliation. It is the slow transformation into something unrecognizable, even to yourself. Time did what violence could not. It softened resistance, blurred memory, and reshaped identity. For many of the wives of defeated warriors, the most devastating stage of captivity was not the moment of capture, nor the public humiliation, nor even forced servitude. It was assimilation, the quiet, relentless rewriting of who they were. Death would have preserved their names in memory. Assimilation erased them entirely. It began subtly. A new name spoken often enough that the old one felt distant. A command repeated in the Norse tongue until the rhythm of their native language faded from daily use. At first, the women spoke their mother tongue in whispers to one another, but whispers drew suspicion. Punishments followed. Gradually, survival demanded adaptation. Words once sacred became dangerous. Silence replaced them. Language is more than communication. It carries worldview, myth, belief. As the captive women learned the speech of their captors, they were also absorbing fragments of Norse cosmology. The stories of Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, Ragnarok's inevitable end. Over years, these myths filled the space where their own traditions had once lived. Not always by belief, but by repetition. The human mind adapts to what surrounds it. Clothing shifted too. At first, the rough wool felt foreign. But seasons passed, and the texture became familiar. Jewelry bearing Norse symbols appeared at their throats, not by choice, but by expectation. A carved pendant of Thor's hammer might hang where once a cross or local talisman had rested. Outward transformation often precedes inward change. The most profound shift came through motherhood. Children born of these forced unions grew up fully immersed in Viking society. They learned the sagas, practiced the customs, worshipped the gods of their fathers. To them, this was normal. To their mothers, it was a daily paradox. They loved their children fiercely. Love does not ask for context, yet each milestone felt like another stone placed over the grave of their past. Some mothers attempted resistance through secrecy. A lullaby from their homeland disguised within a Norse melody. A carved symbol hidden beneath floorboards. A story told at night about a hero who once defended a distant village. But children are shaped by their environment. As they grew, many identified more with the warriors around them than with the quiet sorrow in their mother's eyes. Archaeological evidence hints at this assimilation. Graves of women in Scandinavian lands sometimes contain foreign-style jewelry beside Norse artifacts, suggesting blended identities. Were these women willing settlers, or captives absorbed into society? The soil does not speak clearly, but it reveals mixture. Bloodlines merged, cultures intertwined. And within a single generation, entire lineages of defeated peoples could vanish without a battle ever being fought again. This was the cruel genius of assimilation. It required no blade, no chain, only time. A woman who once stood proud beside a warrior husband might one day look into a polished shield and barely recognize the reflection. The accent softened. The prayers altered. The old gods forgotten. Not through choice, but erosion. For the Vikings, this was ultimate conquest. Not merely ruling land, but reshaping legacy. A defeated enemy whose descendants bore Norse names, worshipped Norse gods, and told Norse stories posed no threat of rebellion. The transformation ensured stability. Victory echoed into the future. Yet inside many women, something remained unbroken. Memory does not vanish easily. It retreats. It waits. A sudden scent of smoke might recall a burned village. The sound of distant waves might echo the day longships arrived. Assimilation could rewrite daily life, but it could not fully extinguish grief. And so these women lived in a haunting duality, outwardly part of Viking society, inwardly haunted by what had been stolen. They were neither entirely captive, nor entirely free. They existed in between. Death and suffering. Chains bind the body. But assimilation breathes. It walks. It raises children. And it ensures that even when the woman survives, the world she once knew does not. And yet, even after assimilation, one final cruelty lingered, a scar that would ripple beyond their lifetimes, into generations that never witnessed the battlefield, yet carried its shadow all the same. The scars that outlived the sword, the battlefield ended in a single day, but its shadow stretched across generations. And some wounds were never meant to heal. The sagas sing of conquest. They praise the courage of warriors, the strength of longships, the thunder of axes striking shields. They speak of glory earned beneath cold northern skies. But the sagas are selective. They remember the men who died bravely. They rarely speak of the women who survived unwillingly. And survival, for them, was not mercy. It was endurance under a weight history chose not to record. Long after the fires of a burned village faded into soil, the consequences of that raid lived on inside households across Scandinavia and beyond. The wives of defeated warriors carried more than grief. They carried silence. Their children grew up sensing a fracture they could not fully name, a hesitation in their mother's voice when certain songs were sung, a shadow in her eyes when longships returned from new raids. Trauma does not vanish. It seeps quietly into the spaces between words. Some children never knew the truth of their origins. They grew into proud Vikings, warriors themselves perhaps, unaware that their blood carried two histories, one celebrated, one silenced. Others sensed the contradiction. They saw the way their mothers touched hidden carvings on walls. They heard lullabies that did not quite match the rhythm of Norse tradition. These fragments were clues, faint echoes of another world buried beneath forced assimilation. Archaeology today reveals graves where foreign-born women were laid to rest among Norse communities. Isotope analysis shows that many individuals buried in Scandinavian soil were not native to those lands. Their bones tell of distant childhoods, different diets, different climates. The earth remembers what the Sagas omitted. It reveals movement not only of warriors, but of captives, of women transported across seas into lives they never chose. In some burial sites, female skeletons bear marks of violence, strangulation, blade wounds, signs of ritual death. In others, women are interred beside powerful men, suggesting concubinage or forced union. These silent remains are evidence that conquest was never only about land. It was about control over lineage, memory, and the future itself. The most haunting truth is this: the scars did not end with the women who first endured them. Generational trauma reshapes families invisibly. A mother who learned to silence, her grief teaches silence without meaning to. A child raised in an atmosphere of fear learns caution as instinct. Across centuries, such patterns embed themselves into culture. They alter behavior, belief, and identity. For the wives of defeated warriors, every breath was resistance. But resistance does not always triumph. Many died unnamed. Their past dissolved into the culture that consumed them. Their original villages faded into myth. Their husbands' names were lost, except in the soil of forgotten battlefields. And yet, the truth refuses to stay buried. Modern historians challenge romanticized images of Vikings as merely noble explorers or fearless adventurers. They examine trade networks built on slavery. They study texts describing thralls as foundational to Norse economy. They piece together the lives of women whose suffering was systematized. Each discovery fractures the polished image of conquest and reveals something far more complex and far darker. This is not a story of simple villains and victims. History rarely offers such clarity. It is a story of power exercised without mercy, of cultural systems that normalized humiliation, of societies that sanctified domination through ritual and law. It is a story that forces uncomfortable reflection. When we look back at the Viking Age, it is easy to admire the ships, the craftsmanship, the mythology. It is harder to confront the human cost hidden behind that legacy. For every warrior who died swiftly, there were wives who lived on in chains. Physical, psychological, cultural. Death is final. It closes the page. But survival under oppression keeps the wound open. So when we remember the Viking Age, we must ask, whose voices were preserved and whose were silenced? Whose glory was sung and whose suffering was absorbed into silence? The swords have rusted, the longships have decayed, but the scars, carried in bloodlines, in soil, in the quiet gaps of history, remain. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: if we had lived in that time, would we have sung with the conquerors? Or would we have endured in silence, praying that history would one day remember our names?